Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you know, I am not an attorney, just like yourselves, just plain folks, and I have come into this case as what attorneys call a pro se litigant, and that is just a little legalese type Latin phrase that simply means that I am here in court representing myself, without an attorney, but in a particular type of case that attorneys call a petition for writ of mandamus, described by the courts as an extraordinary remedy, dating back to the earliest days of our experiment in democracy. As you know, this is a case about and connected to the pandemic, and the government's public health response, and the Supreme Court had once suggested that, on matters such as these, during a case about the smallpox vaccine at the beginning of the 20th century, the American century, the only competent evidence that could be presented to the court to prove these propositions was the testimony of experts, giving their opinions. And, when even the esteemed Dr. Fauci has said that this virus has fooled us before, and when Dr. Walensky has, noting that this virus isn't stupid, her observation that, sadly, in pandemic, human choices have not served us well should resonate with many. The director of the World Health Organization, at the end of 2021, had lamented that surely we have come to recognize by now that we underestimate this virus at our own peril, and, it should be clear, quite frankly, that this pandemic is, or at least was an A-team problem, requiring an A-team solution, with no time to be looking at Mr. T, just pitying the fool. And, you may recall from your history lessons in grammar school, or high school that a case called Marbury v. Madison, and that case was a case also that had been brought upon mandamus, and heard by the Chief Justice, John Marshall, whose home I have often passed down in Richmond, just a short block's walk away from the circuit courthouse. The folks that we had elected to Congress as our representatives in Washington, and to whom even our courts extend a legislative deference, had thought this idea of mandamus was so very important that, under 28 U.S.C. section 1651a, the Supreme Court and all courts established by Act of Congress may issue all writs necessary or appropriate in aid of their respective jurisdictions and agreeable to the usages and principles of law. And, from the early days of the Republic, it has been established that, to render a mandamus a proper remedy, the officer to whom it is directed must be one to whom, on legal principles, such writ must be directed, and the person applying for it must be without any other specific remedy, and even that reviewing court had noted in that landmark case, Marbury v. Madison, that no act of the legislature confers so extraordinary a privilege, nor can it derive countenance from the doctrines of the common law. In fact, the courts of this here Commonwealth of Virginia have recognized that a mandamus is an extraordinary remedy employed to compel a public official to perform a purely ministerial duty imposed upon him by law, to make a government official just do his or her job, and, at least under the laws of Virginia, the writ of mandamus issues, no matter from what court it is issued, only in those cases in which there is no other adequate legal remedy, and, therefore, to prevent a failure of justice. Now, Reverend King, a good friend of my father, talked a lot about justice, justice flowing like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream, and many admire him today because he wanted to be a drum major for justice, and you know he had a dream. And, much like yourselves, my mama raised me to always choose the hard right thing over the easy wrong. And, even though this is a pro se case, brought by just a normal person like yourselves, without an attorney, the courts have said of these petitions for writ of mandamus that, where the question is one of public right, and the object of the mandamus is to procure the enforcement of a public duty, the people are regarded as the real party, and the relator at whose instigation the proceedings are instituted, need not show that he has any legal or special interest in the result, it being sufficient to show that he is a citizen, and as such, interested in the execution of the laws. Still, especially when pursuing a criminal matter that no court nor any law enforcement agency has taken on, and when you find yourself trying to fight City Hall, courts have given notice that life has no guarantee, and generally, it is clear that mandamus is awarded not as a matter of right, but only in the exercise of sound judicial discretion. And, even if your folks raised you right, you look like an intelligent person, and know that things don't always turn out in real life like they do in fairy tales. And, now we are at the climax finale scene of our journey, as we have come now to what attorneys call closing arguments, a term you may be familiar with from TV and the movies. And, I want to personally thank you for the time that you have dedicated to fulfill an important duty that is a cornerstone of our democratic form of government. I know you're very tired. You've been very patient. This final day has been a long one, so I'll speak only a few minutes. And, at least anyone who has grown up in black church knows that is usually a signal to tell your mama you may be detained for a little while, because you know that dog don't hunt. So, let's go back to the beginning, again, and run this story from the top. On the first anniversary of the pandemic declaration, the president, addressing the nation from the White House, had told the American people that he'd like to talk to you about where we are as we mark 1 year since everything stopped because of this pandemic. According to the president, at that time, and placing the nation on a war footing, not just hyperbole, had reminded us that we were hit with a virus that was met with silence and spread unchecked. Denials for days, weeks, then months that led to more deaths, more infections, more stress, and more loneliness. As we all remember, according to the president, at that time, when the total deaths in America had totaled 527,726, more deaths than in World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and 9/11 combined, photos and videos from 2019 felt like they were taken in another era. The last vacation. The last birthday with friends. The last holiday with the extended family. And, while it was different for everyone, we all lost something. Weddings, birthdays, graduations, all the things that needed to happen but didn't. The first date. The family reunions. The Sunday night rituals. The president had described it as the collective suffering. A collective sacrifice. A year filled with the loss of life, and the loss of living for all of us. Standing together, still, we've lost family and friends. We've lost businesses and dreams we spent years building. We've lost time with each other. And our children have lost so much time with their friends, time with their schools. No graduation ceremonies this spring. No graduations from college, high school, moving up ceremonies. The president had said. Moreover, the president had assured the American people, who he said deserved to know the truth, had claimed that this virus has kept us apart, placing the blame upon the virus. But, in the loss, we saw how much there was to gain in appreciation, respect, and gratitude, he said. Finding light in the darkness is a very American thing to do. In fact, it may be the most American thing we do, the president said, while he had noted at that time that, sadly, many of us had lost faith and trust that government could the big and important things that matter, but what the president did not say, and probably could not, at that time, that just a few days later, on March 23, 2021, the White House would begin a pattern of evasion, refusing to respond to a request for information under the Freedom of Information Act, seeking to determine merely whether certain standard epidemiological metrics, i.e., infectious dose and/or secondary attack rate, were classified information, because, in the expert opinion of a former biological warfare planner, the disease appeared to be defying what the reported metrics had seemed to suggest about the nature, origins and etiology of a novel coronavirus. Moreover, those metrics could not be classified information unless the government had owned the novel coronavirus, which only then could have found its origins in a laboratory, origins that, just 2 months later, after the deadline to respond to the FOIA request, would find the president tasking the intelligence community to redouble its efforts to determine the origins, coalescing around only two limiting scenarios: a natural spillover or an escape from a laboratory, possibilities that, according to the metrics that had been reported in multiple peer-reviewed reports, but not acknowledged or accepted by the CDC, could not have occurred. Similarly, the prosecutor, Brian Porter, who had filed a motion to dismiss in January, but who has now for 6 months failed to docket for a hearing, wants you to believe, as probably you do, that pandemics are completely natural events, but the job of a prosecutor's job is to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for every element of a crime. And, if there is any reasonable doubt, at least in a criminal trial, the jury has a duty to acquit the accused. In November 2021, Brian Lawler Porter, a native of Alexandria, who had begun his legal career after graduating from Virginia Commonwealth University with a degree in political science, as an Alexandria police officer, while attending the night law school program at George Mason University, had, at least according to the press, just won an uncontested re-election as a Democrat for his third term as the Commonwealth's attorney in Alexandria, and he told the Alexandria Times, "I must be doing something right," Porter said of the election, but what was not reported in the press was that, during the off-year elections, the Commonwealth attorney was not actually running unopposed, and was, in fact, running from a commercial process server, who had attempted to serve a complaint against him, brought on mandamus, to compel him to charge the former City of Alexandria sheriff, a fellow Democrat, Dana Lawhorn, who had, before his retirement, refused to serve a complaint against the former governor, Dr. Ralph Northam, MD, the very first legal challenge filed against the lockdowns in Virginia, a matter about which the prosecutor had elected a right to remain silent, even to voters. And, in November 2021, Brian Porter, a lifelong Alexandrian, who had taken office in 2014, and spent his first 2 years in office consumed with prosecuting Alexandria serial killer Charles Severance, about which experience he later wrote a book about the experience, boastfully told reporters about his re-election. "Hopefully it shows that I've got the right blend of forward-thinking policies, and that I help keep the community safe." And, yet, today, as reported in the New York Times, the community level of COVID-19 in Alexandria is low based on cases and hospitalizations, according to the most recent update from the CDC on March 23. The number of hospitalized COVID patients has fallen in the Alexandria area, but deaths have remained at about the same level. As the state of emergency was de-escalated across the nation, an average of 5 cases per day were reported in Alexandria, a 35% decrease from the average weeks ago, and, since the beginning of the pandemic, a total of 45,665 cases have been reported, in a city with a population of a little over 155,000, which, but not for the fact that many of these cases are reinfections, would appear on casual observation to indicate that almost 1/3 of Alexandria residents had been infected with the novel coronavirus, from which, since the beginning of the pandemic, at least 1 in 688 residents have died of COVID-19, a total of 232 reported deaths. After his unopposed re-election, Brian Porter had proudly bragged that when he first got elected, an elected politician who will remain nameless told him, "Hey, you just got elected. Don't screw this up," and that became his mantra. Brian Porter likes to think that 8 years in I hadn't screwed it up, and his goal is to leave the office with its reputation intact, so he can hand it off successfully to whoever comes after him. But, globally, as of 12:23 p.m. Central European Summer Time, June 7, 2023, there have been 767,750,853 confirmed cases of COVID-19, including 6,941,095 deaths, reported to WHO. As of June 6, 2023, a total of 13,396,086,098 vaccine doses have been administered. And the Alexandria prosecutor, Brian Porter, who, like Mayor Justin Wilson, is graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University, a state partner in Virginia's COVID-19 response, and who had run unopposed on the ballot a few years ago, would have the people believe that this was just some natural event in nature. Brian Porter, a major in political science, but not biological sciences, like virology, microbiology or vaccinology, told reporters after his re-election, "Remember that I'm just one small drop of water in the ocean of Commonwealth's attorneys." But, Brian Porter has tried 11 murder trials and more than 50 jury trials, would also go on to write a children's book in 2019. He is credited with founding the Alexandria Mental Health Initiative and the Alexandria Treatment Court as alternatives to jail for people with mental health and substance abuse issues. Brian Porter is no longer some new kid on the block with no experience, and he had formerly served as an officer with the Alexandria Police Department and should have sufficient skills to determine whether a crime has been committed. On February 2, 2021, Reverend Don Davidson, also an alumnus of Virginia Commonwealth University, the former senior pastor for the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, wrote in his pastor's blog, "On Friday, January 22nd, we both had rapid tests at Innova Urgent Care in Vienna, and the results came back positive." Days before this announcement, on January 19th, Pastor Davidson had shared in his blog that he had just completed physical examination by his doctor, who had him complete a stress test, a sleep test, and a catheterization, with no indications at that time that Pastor Davidson, then age 67, had yet been infected. 1 month before, on January 5, 2021, while celebrating his 48th year as a pastor, a profession he had begun while he was still a freshman at Virginia Commonwealth University, Pastor Davidson wrote that he had been saddened and disappointed by Sherry Graveson's decision to leave us and return to the organist position at Emmanuel Lutheran Church. The story about the infection of Mrs. Graveson and her husband, along with their 2 sons during the first Mother's Day in a pandemic declaration, had achieved national recognition, in a story published in the Washington Post, very early in the pandemic, and finding that family asking the essential question, what were the odds? And the Alexandria prosecutor, Brian Porter, who had run unopposed on the ballot a few years ago, would have the people believe that when the Don Davidson, the former pastor of the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, and his wife Audrey, were infected with the novel coronavirus, perhaps because they were selfish, had done something wrong, or were just unfortunate victims of bad luck. But, if that was so, why did the Commonwealth attorney keep silent about how he had evaded a commercial process server while he was seeking re-election to his 3rd term? Why did the sheriff, who he sought to protect, suddenly find Jesus during a pandemic, and just before that November election, joining the church where Reverend Davidson had pastored, and where the Graveson family had attended? Why did the sheriff refuse to serve a complaint on the former Democrat Party governor of Virginia as early as March 2020, as the pandemic was just beginning? If Brian Porter had to prosecute a novel coronavirus for the infections of Pastor Davidson, his wife and the Graveson family, members of the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, could he make that case, beyond a reasonable, and convict that defendant, as he had convicted the murderer, Charles Severance, and wrote about in his book? On January 19, 2021, according to the pastor's blog, posted contemporaneously, on the website for the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, Pastor Davidson was at the Innova healthcare facility in Fairfax, in close contact with doctors and public healthcare workers, while undergoing a routine physical examination, a stress test, a sleep test and a catheterization, rather invasive medical procedures, during which, according to his blog, one of the things he could remember was hearing music playing in the background, particularly the popular song, Purple Rain. By timeline, If Pastor Davidson and his wife had tested positive on January 22, they would have to have already been infected on the day they were at the healthcare facility, but there are no reports of any infections or outbreaks there. Can the prosecutor bring a conviction against a novel coronavirus that only the Davidson family appears to have caught, while surrounded by medical professionals? Did the prosecutor, Brian Porter, screw this one up? Going back to when we were children, I think most of us, probably all of us here in the courtroom, once thought that justice came into being of its own accord, that virtue was its own reward, that good would triumph over evil, in short, that justice occurred automatically. Later, when we found that this wasn't quite so, most of us still felt hopefully that at least justice occurred frequently of its own accord. Today, I think that almost all of us would have to agree that there is really no machinery, not on this earth at least, which causes justice to occur automatically. Men have to make it occur. Individual human beings have to make it occur. Otherwise, it doesn't come into existence. This is not always easy. Even the Fourth Circuit, during the turbulent days of the civil rights struggle in the 1960s, had said in a case, U.S. v. Chalk, that all power can be abused when placed in unworthy hands, and had acknowledged that even the courts, where we seek justice, cannot prevent every wrong, but at least sometimes can correct those wrongs at some time after the fact, after the wrongs, after the injuries, the harms, the grief and the heartache. And sometimes we do have to say that it is what it is, and maybe the crucial lesson in life is possessing the discernment and wisdom to know when to take that stand that may actually make a difference. As a matter of fact, according to one prosecutor, in a famous case, this process is always hard, because justice, he said, presents a threat to power. In order to make justice come into being, you often have to fight power. Even Reverend King, a man who many today admire, had expressed his belief that lamentably, it is an historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but, as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. And, today, I am not just bringing a case by myself as a pro se litigant, and I am not just here to be that voice for the Pastor Davidsons and the Graveson families, who have been, perhaps like yourselves, been infected, or even worse, who have lost opportunities to be together, to take vacations, had missed school, or who may have even lost a business. Essentially, to the extent that this is a case to convict or acquit a novel coronavirus, I have become the criminal defense attorney for a virus they say isn't stupid, and whose rampage has been attributed to the loss of more lives than Hitler in the Holocaust in half the time. And, if, by the metrics, recorded diligently in the science reports, even if not reported in any news, my client could not infect or kill any person by itself, under the law, where we have always cherished a presumption of innocence, just as much as a right to remain silent, and even confront one's accusers, somebody should have to go to jail, or what philosophers describe as retributive justice. And, in the same vein, if you or a loved one, like the Davidsons and the Gravesons, have been infected, or even worse, under the law, you are entitled to restitution, or restorative justice, to be made whole, not just, as promised often in pandemic, to be just healed. Greed, for lack of a better word here, is good. Under the facts that you have heard, somebody, who has elected a right to remain silent, doesn't want to go to jail, even if for you nothing in life is free, and you always have to pay somewhere in the end, and that just doesn't sound fair, at least to me. Someone, who elected a right to remain silent, wants to blame your pain on a novel coronavirus, or even blame your injuries on something that you did wrong, but who took away your freedoms, maybe even tried to kill you with this novel coronavirus, and they want you to just forgive and forget, even though we have a courthouse where they say you can get justice. In one movie, a character played by the actor Samuel L. Jackson in the movie Pulp Fiction, had asked, "What does Marcellus Wallace look like?" And I turn that question back on you. Do you look like a bitch? Because that is some bitch shit. Where my bitches at? America, my friends, is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and in America, you can be whatever it is you set your mind to be. And if you want to be a sucker, or if you want to be a bitch, you certainly have that right. And one day, and that day may never come, if you reject the science, you're gonna need a Pastor Davidson, or maybe even a Bishop Gerald Glenn to perform a service for you, because ultimately, especially for folks like Bishop Glenn, this is not just about them, but about you, and science says that if you have already been infected, your chances of serious outcomes actually increases on reinfection, even if you have a right to believe in some accrued natural immunity. But, at least to me, you look like an intelligent person, and you have the power to be somebody else, maybe even be that hero you had always wanted to be. Make your mama proud, and give that kid some role model to look up to. According to the president, we know what we have to do to defeat this virus: tell the truth and follow the science. And the science says clearly that in February 2020, after 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists had examined 19 times more cases than had yet been reported in the United States by mid-March 2020, just a few months before the Graveson family had been infected, the novel coronavirus had a secondary attack rate of less than 5%, or about your chances of winning on a 2-number combination at the roulette table at the casino, and if you have gone to 7-Eleven to purchase a lottery ticket, you know that your chances of being a jackpot winner are extremely rare. But that virus infected both the Davidson and Graveson family, fellow residents in Alexandria, your neighbor, and even Hillary Clinton has said that the Bible tells us to love our neighbors. But you can leave this courtroom and return to your loved ones, family and friends, and do them a favor. Gather them in real close, and be honest, really honest for maybe the very first time in your life, look them in the eye and say, I really don't love you and never did. Or you can take that power that is in your hands today and be somebody else, actually doing the right thing, and turning those dreams you once thought were impossible into a reality. Believe it or not, it's really just that simple. And this is your Independence Day. Whether you leave today free from those burdens that had encumbered your past is up to you, choosing to be a free and independent person, or just another slave, subject to that same problem just happening to you over and over again, because you have relinquished control of your life and destiny to others, as a child would to a responsible adult, because he, or she, can do no other. My mama used to say, I brought you into this world and I can take you out. And, as adults, further, we have responsibilities, and all choices arising from our decisions, great and small, have consequences. For every action, science says, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and whether you chose to acquit the novel coronavirus of acting alone in these infections is a choice that, as my Sunday school teacher used to say, is between you and your God. I cannot make that choice for you. But, as you have said you have done for over 3 years now, we can only ask that you follow the science, do the right thing, and take that path of virtue, at this crossroads in your life, that leads to character. This is not just a case about how Pastor Davidson and his wife got infected, or how the Graveson family got infected, but extends to what at least appears to be about 1/3 of the residents of Alexandria, your neighbors, your friends and your family, caught in a common fate and destiny that extends to now over 1 million other fellow Americans. At the conclusion of what would become his last public address, Reverend King, a man often quoted and much admired, had retold the biblical parable about the Good Samaritan, and had related to that audience his journey to the Holy Land with his wife, and suggesting his epiphany regarding the reactions of most who had seen a man in distress on the winding and treacherous road descending from Jerusalem to Jericho, a place he had described as a perfect place for an ambush. Reverend King, who had said he had resolved that longevity had its place, and that he was not afraid of any man, had speculated, telling us what he said his imagination told him, it's possible that these men were afraid. And so, he said, The first question that the Levite asked was, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But then the Good Samaritan came by. And he reversed the question, "If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" That's the question before you tonight. Not, "If I stop to help, what will happen to all of the hours that I usually spend in my office every day and every week as a pastor?" The question is not, "If I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me?" If I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That's the question, according to Reverend King. And if that is not your question, then, my friend, I am sorry to let you know that you are no Dr. King. I rest my case.
This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.